And a very good morning to you. We're live from London. You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson. Coming up today, my guests share their views on the week's biggest stories. Stephen Dalziel and Vincent McAviney are ready, standing by. Vinny, good morning. What have you spotted?
Good morning. Well, there is this big meeting in China with India, Russia and North Korea popping up as well, and some disharmony in Normandy given the impending move of the Bayeux Tapestry. Curators there saying it can't make the journey.
Thank you very much indeed for that. We'll be checking in with our Oslo correspondent.
I'm Lars Bevanger, Monocle's Oslo correspondent, and this morning I'm talking about why Norway's oil fund no longer invests in bulldozers and why have all of Oslo's trams come to a shuddering halt.
Thank you for that, Lars. Plus, we'll be hearing from our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, fresh from his party in Lisbon. That's all coming up 31st of August 2025, live from London. This is Monocle on Sunday.
Live from London, this is Monocle on Sunday with Emma Nelson.
And a very good morning to everybody. Happy Sunday to Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst and translator of the Navalny autobiography Patriot, and Vincent McAviney, journalist and Monocle Radio regular. Very good morning to you both, gentlemen. How are we feeling?
Good morning. Well, it feels like the last day of summer. I had a pretty autumnal day yesterday, but it's nice and sunny here in London this morning. But everything sort of kicks back off again this week properly, doesn't it?
Yeah, he's got a face on when he says that. Everybody, how about you, Stephen?
I'm quite bright and cheery, particularly because my birthday falls in September, I suppose. And I'm not afraid of new birthdays, so they do make us older, I know, but with age comes experience. So, no, I'm feeling pretty bright.
We'll be talking birthdays in a minute. Yes, it was one of those moments this week. I was sitting by the Birdie in Zurich in boiling sunshine on Wednesday afternoon. And then suddenly this enormous gust of wind arrived, blew all the leaves off the trees and the clouds came in and it started to rain. And we literally saw summer finish and autumn arrive. Keeping a very sunny, summery disposition and indeed a birthday feeling in Lisbon is our editorial director, Tyler Brûlé. A very good morning to you, Tyler. Bom dia.
Bon dia. Good morning, Emma. What a difference a week makes. I mean, you talked about the body. I can't believe that we were standing side by side last week, anchoring radio out of Zurich. And here, well, there you are in Studio One with some fine gentlemen, and here I am on a terrace in Lisbon.
So tell us about Lisbon, because looking at your column from this weekend, it catalogues the preparation required for your mother's 80th birthday celebrations. And you conclude your column with the words, "Off I go." So off it went. How was it?
It was very good. We are surveying a balcony, which probably went only 6 hours ago, 7 hours ago, was of course full with parting relatives and friends, and it was an absolute delight. But yes, going back to the column which of course hit people's inboxes on one side of the world already this morning, and I think still hitting boxes as of course the sun moves. It was one of those things, you know. We thought about Mom's 80th all the way back at probably around Christmas time. Who should come? Should we do it in Lisbon? Will the flat be ready? Of course, it'll all be ready. And then of course the RSVP started rolling in, and of course the day approaches, and for whatever reason, right? It's just that it's not even the week before; it's those hours before that you find you have to have a handyman come in. Where are you going to find a handyman? Because, as you said, London, of course, moves into this sort of moment of everyone returning. France is already back at work for a week. But actually, the Portuguese schools don't go back till much later, like well into September. And actually, a lot of people go on holiday now. So all of those trusty shops I thought would be open to sort out various things were not. So that meant a whole new day of discovery yesterday in the very best way.
And what did you discover? Because there's a glorious list of all the things that you required that you needed and also got done.
Yeah, it got done, and things I didn't know I needed as well. Emma, I found a store for you in the Alvalade section of town, which I know it is so up Emma Nelson's street. So I was looking for, I wanted to replace a rug at the entry. Didn't know that I would buy a second one. But there was this, I guess the shop, I don't know how, what sort of the design was originally. Maybe the front of the store could have been, I don't know, I was sort of thinking it was some kind of garage, but it didn't look very industrial. So they did a very good job of course, disguising it. I think the shop's been around since the 1950s, so they might have been replacing tires at one point. But there's this ramp in the store, and then you go down, and it is this amazing treasure trove of just textiles and rugs. But they have a whole, I can't even call it a department, but they've just got a wall to play out every domestic fantasy that you might have. So I said I didn't know I was in the market for smocks, and there was this very sort of one of those sort of spitting display units with very sort of small smocks for 3 or 4 year olds. I said, do you have any of these in adult sizes? Well, then a woman goes down the back and just returns with stacks and stacks of gingham smocks. So listen, if you wanted to go and run a global art school with branches in all corners of the world, you could completely outfit all of your faculty there. Not to mention, of course, have smocky uniforms for all your toddlers. But then if you have a major domo who's running front of house, if you need a uniform for your gardener, if you need various from morning till evening attire for your housekeepers, they had everything. So that was a complete revelation, because I would have gone to another store, but found this place. So that was sort of all. It was because also it was an exploration. It was a moment of discovery of a city where we're just of course establishing roots, and that was a real sort of side delight. Party aside.
So obviously an on-air radio request is being made for a smock to be dispatched back to London, if you wouldn't mind. But a smock isn't a smock without a good pocket.
What do you mean, one pocket? I mean, massive patch pockets that you could also put 2 toddlers in as well. No, they have figured this out. This obviously been mastered across the decades. Listen, order taken.
Thank you.
What is coming your way?
Thank you. That's very kind of you. Right. Smocks aside, I didn't think we'd be talking about this on the radio. I thought we'd be talking about what happened at the party and how Aunt Suzanne and Uncle Ian are getting on this morning.
I think Aunt Suzanne and Uncle Ian are absolutely fine, because the party continues. And it is one of those strange things, because I'm not a big fan of those wedding weekends that have turned into sort of wedding weeks. And this is not quite like that, because there was a Friday evening, because of course you have to people have flown in from all over the world for Mom's birthday. So of course, you lay on an event on Friday evening for them, but we haven't done anything sort of too planned. People have been just, you're on your own until there is the next thing we're doing, and that was obviously a party last night, and now we're going out to the coast a little bit later, today for a midday lunch. And some people are joining, and some people have already scampered off to other destinations and points. Of course, people making the relatives who've come from Canada really making a point of being on this side of the world and enjoying the end of the European summer.
And indeed, it is a decade now since the Monocle Quality of Life Conference took place in Lisbon. Can we firmly say that 10 years on, the Portuguese know how to set up a party for you?
Well, they do, and João, big surprise that it was João who was in charge of the cooking last night with his band of waiters and bartenders. But yes, they did a very good job, and this is interesting, because it was there was a bit of of course there was a brief, and there was multiple tastings that happened before. But João used to cook in Maputo, in Mozambique, and returned to Portugal. And so it was just this fantastic blend of Mozambican cuisine with Portuguese classics, and everything kicked off. We have another friend from the mix from Argentina who, listen, if this broadcasting journalism gig does not work out for any of us,
right.
you need to move into the pina colada business, because our friend Pablo from Argentina, I think he's got something like 10, 12 different pina colada stands around Lisbon, Porto. He's gone on to Rome now, and you'd also want to have a pineapple plantation as well. I mean, it is remarkable, because you get it in a pineapple. So someone's doing very well in Costa Rica, and he's trying to sort of figure out, can he actually source pineapples from the former colonies of Portugal to sort of make it feel a little bit more on brand. They're trying to make it happen but you only get sort of midget pineapples, I think, from Madeira, so that's not working. You need sort of the real deal, probably hormone-infused ones from Costa Rica. And anyway, so that was the welcome when people arrived. So down at street level, all of the relatives, Aunt Suzanne, Uncle Ian, Cousin Christy all arrived with, getting up to our apartment with pina coladas. But then, of course...
In pineapples?
Yeah, in full pineapples.
Right, okay.
So, yeah.
What was it like getting them in the lift?
Yeah, well, I know. Listen, and also, in an old Portuguese lift where there's two gates to close as well, and you've got, Anyway, I'm not sure how sort of sticky it is in the hallway. I haven't gone to survey the engineering in the building this morning. We will see later. But then you had the competition because, of course, the gentleman who was running the bar for Joao, then he was, of course, just doing a mean caipirinha for people who, once they got upstairs as well. So, listen, things got off in fine form very, very quickly.
Good. I'm so glad to hear it. So, the warmest of wishes to your mum and her on celebrating her 80th. What's this time next week? You're going to be in Barcelona. But are you going to be taking the pineapples?
Well, I don't think we're taking the pineapples, but yes, I mean, this will be that moment next week where there'll be much reflection on the Quality of Life conference. We had the lovely Linda was also, as she appeared in our column, of course, our listeners will know Linda being the woman who runs our operations in Merano, in northern Italy, in Südtirol for us. So Linda was also here for the party yesterday, and is always just an amazing hand to just ensure everything pulls together. I think she's part of the very, very advanced party. So she heads off to Barcelona tomorrow, and I think there's probably about 30 or 35 people from our team who will be in Barcelona. So it's another wave on Tuesday, Wednesday, and then things all kick off on Thursday evening with a fantastic cocktail at the Miro Foundation, and then it is full conference all day Friday. So we will have much to discuss. I will be joining you from a northern point in Mallorca next weekend because, as I said, for my mom's, it's not used to. It's always sort of in birthday week. It's birthday fortnight for mom right now. So not the party, but at least the celebration will continue in Mallorca end of next week.
Oh, why not make it a birthday month? Tyler Brûlé in Lisbon, probably with a mop at the bottom of the lift. Thank you so much for joining us on the line from the Portuguese capital. You mentioned a moment ago, Stephen, that you're going to have a birthday. Well, beat that.
I won't even compete with that. And also, I hasten to add, it will not be my 80th. What I was particularly interested in Tyler talking about this. Now, how about this for Radio Segue? Was talking about these Portuguese smocks because I wanted to ask him if he has a Ukrainian vyshyvanka. Because Ukrainian vyshyvanka is the embroidered shirts, and I have two, and I was wearing one of them on Friday night at a concert of the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra here at the Cadogan Hall in London. This is this wonderful orchestra. It was first created in 2022, just after the start of the war, by Kerry Lynn Wilson, who may not sound very Ukrainian, but she's a Canadian of Canadian-Ukrainian heritage. She's the conductor, and she created this orchestra from Ukrainian musicians who are already living abroad, some who left because of the start of the war, some who've come out to join the orchestra, a 77-strong orchestra, playing Beethoven's Fifth. They were wonderful, and you had to hear the standing ovation. And then they played right at the very end, principally on a single violin, but then with others gently coming in, a specially composed version of the Ukrainian national anthem. It sounds a cliche, but talk about there wasn't a dry eye in the house. It was so moving, and a number of us were wearing our vyshyvanka. So perhaps Tyler should get his Ukrainian vyshyvanka.
It's an interesting thing because we'll talk a little bit later on about politics and music, but I think that Kerry Lynn Wilson's husband is the general manager of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. So you do have that idea that music isn't just music anymore, in the same way that every company is now a political entity, but you have that idea that what goes on behind the scenes is just as important as what's played on stage.
Yeah, and I think it should be. I'm very much one of these, and we seem to be moving towards the story I think you're hinting at. Of the story of one of your favourite, I think I'm right in saying, I know you're a great opera lover, far more than I am. But Netrebko,
Anna Netrebko,
Russian soprano, who has been known in the past to support Putin, and indeed in 2014, after the illegal seizure of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine, was seen waving the flag of what they called Novorossiya, the new Russia part of Ukraine that Russia was trying to get back and is still trying to get back completely. And she has been blacked by the Met in New York and various other places, but now. And Emma, you know far more about this, and it's far closer to your heart in the operatic sense. She is about to sing at the Royal Opera House in London, and I, for one, think it's outrageous. I think the way the war is going, the way the war's gone on for so long, that. A message needs to be sent by saying that Russia is a pariah nation and Russia's representatives should not be appearing at major events, be they cultural, sporting or anything else, throughout the world.
Indeed, the interesting thing about Netrebko is that she is effectively Putin's poster child. I'm just looking at a picture now of her. I think she was awarded the People's Artist of Russia in 2008. And, it's Putin and it's Netrebko, and they are close. And she has always been associated with him on a very close basis. She was effectively banned from most Western opera houses after the invasion of Ukraine. She has now denounced him and is now getting back on the circuit. And it's become, again, Vinny, this thing where politics is phenomenally important when it comes to, you would think going to the opera is a pretty innocent thing. It's really, really not. Because you mentioned the same comparison when it comes to sport as well.
Yeah, initially tennis players were getting caught out by this. Russian tennis players were barred from international tournaments. Some of them then sort of denounced. And then you've had this issue as well with the Olympics where, Russia has effectively been banned since 2014 because of the doping that went on at Sochi, but also then that first initial invasion of Ukraine. Many Russian athletes, though, have sort of gone under the sort of no-nation teams, but there have been at times where a few of them have sort of either said things or displayed things which are sort of symbols that they are still sort of Russian supporters. So it is very delicate and very tricky. And of course, they were kicked out of cultural things as well, like Eurovision, and Ukraine managed to win that competition shortly after the invasion. So these things do get completely sort of wrapped up into the politics of the day now.
And indeed, I think there's an awful lot of argument about this because this opera singer appearing in London has prompted anger from New York. Back to the Metropolitan Opera has written publicly and said, you do this at your peril because if you're on the wrong side of history. But Stephen, this is that constant struggle that the world is having at the moment with to what degree do you accept that Russia is still involved in the outside world? I mean, the European Union is still struggling to get rid of its gas imports. I know it's dropped its share to 19% rather than 49% of Russian gas imports. But it goes against fundamentally what several countries have vowed to do. It flies in the face of sanctions. It flies in the face of diplomacy. How do you square that circle as someone who focuses so closely on Russia?
Well, first of all, I think at least the three of us in the studio here would agree that culture and politics definitely overlap. And of course, economics do as well. If you put a diagram together, there's a huge area of overlap. And I think generally the European Union is going in the right way. And if the European Union needed any lesson, it came this week when one of the greatest bombardments that Russia has made of Kiev so far actually hit a European Union building in Kiev. And, I don't know if people are still living in the past and think that these things are rather like fireworks. You just light the blue touch paper and they'll hit wherever they hit. These are targeted. This is not a coincidence. The fact that they also took out a 5-story block of flats in Kiev, killing more than 20 people. We don't know for sure exactly how many have died yet. That again, this is not just rogue missiles or drones just flying and hitting whatever. The Russians knew what they were doing. And so, if the European Union needed a lesson, they've had one of their own buildings hit in Kiev. The problem in the European Union, of course, you have, I would call them rogue states like Hungary, who say not only that they want it for economic reasons, but for political reasons too. Orban is one of Putin's greatest supporters around the world, which is very worrying. And there is talk, should Hungary be expelled or at least suspended from the European Union? I think because the war has gone on so long and because the terrible crimes that Russia is still committing, I'm afraid I'm very hard line on this. And I think that Hungary should be at least suspended from the European Union, and that the world has got to sit up and wake up. Because the other thing, of course, now is we have a big question mark over what's coming from the other side of the Atlantic with Trump.
It is really interesting on the point about Hungary, because you sort of think the time of the sort of rapid expansion of the EU in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was just sort of unforeseeable that there would be a backslide, particularly in the east of Europe, towards being sort of Russophiles. And there isn't really a mechanism or procedure or anything to follow with what you do with Hungary now. And we saw it in a way with Poland under the previous government, that sliding away from the sort of European norms, things like the anti-LGBT zones, it kind of going into a sort of hard right sort of Catholicism in its sort of legislative practices, and then the sort of voters corrected that, and now it's sort of back on track. But in Hungary, because of what Orban has done to the culture and the media and the educational establishments, what Trump is now doing across the Atlantic, there's just sort of not that much of a prospect unless there's a major economic downturn, which would only happen if potentially EU funding was sort of pulled or stalled, that you would then have any kind of real backlash swell against Orban that would get him out. So it sort of shows that post-Cold War, we didn't really think that Russia would return in the way it has.
And just to underline that, as someone who actually covered for the BBC in 1989 the fall of communism, the dominoes as they were, they went one after another, and the two leading countries in that were Poland and Hungary. So as you say, Vinny, I mean, this is absolutely true. No one in the 90s would have thought, well, they would be the countries that would slide backwards 30 years later, and yet they have been the two. As you say, fortunately, Poland has come back.
It was that overarching principle, though, that the European Union would be strong enough to ensure that you could have room for a voice of dissent, but that amount of power that an individual country would then exert is something perhaps that no one managed to fathom. I was watching the interview that Angela Merkel gave last week about the 10th anniversary of saying "Wir schaffen das," when there were nigh on 1 million refugees knocking on Germany's doors in 2015. And then, obviously, we know what happened then. We now have 10 years on when people aren't entirely sure what happened in terms of whether it succeeded or whether it didn't, or whether they did actually manage to sort of cope with it. But in that interview, Angela Merkel said, Viktor Orban, who wasn't Prime Minister at the time, I think he was a foreign minister. He had a senior position in the Hungarian government. And she said he was funneling all the refugees towards Germany. It was him who was playing... She said he was playing some dirty tricks in this interview. And you get this feeling, don't you, that Orban and the like were managed 10 years ago. But now when you have a weakening of various parts of, the European leadership, that, we had a weakening from Germany, we had a weakening from, and then the United Kingdom left, you suddenly think, actually, was the European structure strong enough?
I mean, Ursula von der Leyen was sort of on a tour of the sort of former sort of eastern USSR states this week, and she gave a little speech in Latvia, which was interesting, and she talked directly on this. She talked about how Putin has meddled in societies in the West and Europe for a long time now. It's been aggressive. It's been sort of multifaceted. He has weaponized, she said directly, immigration, and we saw that in the borders of Finland recently and other nations where all of a sudden the Russians were using the Wagner Group to fly refugees out of Northeast Africa and then suddenly sort of trying to force them towards Europe as a way of sort of radicalizing populations in Europe and making them sort of, act out and sort of tack to the right in our politics here. So it has been this really multifaceted approach. I think what's wrong, and I think if you talk to younger people, I think it's really fascinating that particularly, I think this is sort of, I'd say in the UK, for instance, I'd say south of sort of 26, when you talk to people of that generation, so talking Gen Z, they don't watch any traditional news broadcasts and they don't read traditional papers, and they get their news from, largely it seems, TikTok. And the perspective that they have, I mean, they're much more doubting of the European Union project, of their own governments in the West, and much more willing, it seems, to think that it's cool to take an alternative take. But often that alternative take, sadly, is Russia and China. And my feeling on TikTok has always been, if in 1983 everyone in Britain woke up and the USSR or China had sent us a TV and we took it into our homes and plugged it in, would we have allowed that? And they controlled the programming. I mean, that is essentially kind of what these platforms are doing in terms of how they're spinning things, particularly we've seen it, war in Ukraine, trying to sort of rewrite the history of that. There is a real sort of disconnect, I think, with the European Union, and largely because of the ages of people, is that there is a good story to tell and a good narrative. And it used to be walk tall with a big stick, but the constant sort of tiny rocks being thrown by Russia and China, particularly on social media, to undermine everything. I think they've got to just get so much better at telling the story of the last kind of 30 years of Putin and what he's done.
I wonder about that just a little bit, given the fact that I would possibly agree slightly in the fact that when it comes to major broadcasters, we no longer have that national coherent moment when we all sit down and watch the news together. It is not a shared experience, and as a result, big questions are actually being asked about your national commitment and your national identity, because you don't actually have shared daily national moments. You have big ones, but the little everyday things have gone. But if you look within the European Union itself, there is a tremendous amount of youth movements and coherence. And because there are some countries which are sort of, conscription is important, not within the European Union, I'm talking more about Switzerland, but that idea of having a national sense of commitment and national sense of identity, I wonder whether that is actually still quite strong in Europe, Stephen.
I don't know. I have my doubts. Talking about conscription, there's, in Finland, it's pretty strong too, actually. I was amused. In fact, my wife and I were recently, like last week, in Switzerland. Tyler, I'm sure, would have appreciated the fact that this very time last week we were strolling along the promenade in Montreux. But we were
up the road from us.
But we'd spent most of the week in the Alps, walking in the Alps. And the Airbnb we were staying in, we were just about to move out, and we got a knock on the door from the hostess saying, "Oh, would you mind? My son, he's got to come and get his military papers because he's got to go off and do his shooting practice this morning." And he was explaining, yes, he does his 18 weeks first of all, and then they do 3 weeks every year. And it struck me then, and he seemed a very nice chap, we had a good chat with him, that, yeah, actually it is that national moment that brings people together. And to take it to Britain, what's worrying, the thing that seems to be uniting people now here is anti-immigration, and people starting to fly flags from lampposts and this sort of thing, which strikes me as a very pernicious, right-wing, rather nasty movement, because you drape yourself in the flag, but not to bring people together. It's more a way of you're together because you're against something else and you're against other people coming into the country.
Indeed.
And I think there is something darker on that, because I've actually seen the people out putting these things up, and I've sort of delved into some of the organising groups online. There's one called sort of Flag Force UK. And what it actually seems to be, in my mind, is a way of trapping politically councils that aren't controlled by reform. So what they're doing is putting these flags up to then dare the council, because so for instance, Islington is one place where this happened, and I've spoken to the council. Now they're going to take them down on the proviso of these could actually be a danger to motorists if they're not fixed properly and they sort of fly off onto a windscreen. And there's also been incidents where in Durham, people have put bunting up, but they've used rope that's so strong that if a high vehicle, a bus or a lorry hit it, it would have the danger of pulling down the post that it's on and causing an accident, because normally that kind of bunting string just breaks really easily. So what the council is saying, they can make an argument on that, but then what Reform particularly, I think, is trying to do, and their candidates, and we've seen it, is then to attack those councils that might be controlled by the Conservatives or Labour or Lib Dems and say they're anti-British and using it as a foil to get them.
There's an interesting piece in this month's Monocle magazine about recruitment campaigns for the military, and they are the idea there of the less palatable parts of the world hijacking flags for political and almost, or dare I say, aggressively, almost violent reasons. It's quite funny that when you look at this article, the idea of fighting for your country is not huge pushed out there. It's actually come for an adventure, be the best that you can be, and indeed channeling the energies of those young people who might actually find themselves in need of a good job, in need of a career, in need of a purpose.
Yeah, I read the article by Julia Lasker and I thought it was fascinating, all the different approaches that were taken. And particularly, here in the UK, they ran an approach a couple of years ago, which was really interesting because it sort of shows why you should have young people in the room. And I think part of the pushback in Europe needs to be political parties should really get into having younger candidates and younger politicians because they can speak natively on platforms like TikTok. We see that with AOC. But there was a pushback in the UK because there was a sort of campaign targeting Gen Z that was sort of slightly kind of like mocking a few years ago. And basically older people just couldn't get their head around the language and all this kind of thing. And they said, this isn't going to work. It led to a huge spike in recruitment of people in that age. And it sort of shows that actually, you need to engage properly with the age group that you're now trying to recruit and sort of get them on board.
You're listening to Monocle on Sunday with me, Emma Nelson, joined around a studio table by Stephen Dalziel, Russia analyst, and Vincent McAviney, journalist and Monocle Radio regular. Let's get the latest news from Norway. Lars Bevanger is on the line. He's our Oslo correspondent. A very good morning to you, Lars. How's it looking where you are?
Good morning. Very, very good morning here, and sunny as well.
Great. Wonderful. Well done on that. Still squeezing a little bit of summer out of somewhere. Let's talk about what you you wanted to talk about the election, doesn't it? Because Norway goes to the polls on the 7th and 8th of September. Lay out the land for us, would you please?
Well, in Norway, the norm is coalition governments because we've got proportional representation, which means you've got loads of smaller parties in addition to the larger traditional Labour and Conservatives. The third big party is the Progress Party, which is to the right of the Conservatives, but still not far right. They're more like a populist party. But the Conservatives and Progress have long been sort of ahead in the polls since the beginning of this year. But then two things happened. The Labour-led coalition with the Centre Party broke up and Labour went into minority government. And then Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre got Jens Stoltenberg, long-time NATO chief, back as finance minister. And now he's very popular in Norway across the spectrum. As a result of these two things, and some other things as well, Labour is now trailing ahead of the centre-right people. So it's hotting up. It's very close still. So we're all very excited to see what happens on the 7th and the 8th of September when people go to the polls.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed for that one. Now, let's talk about the enormous oil fund, which is always something that floats to the top of the news every single time we talk.
Yes, that's right. It is huge. It's worth $20 trillion at the moment. Now, this is money that is ferreted away for a rainy day from the revenues of oil and gas. Norway is one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Norway is now Europe's largest gas exporter to Europe. Now, the fund invests in over 8,000 companies around the world, but it doesn't do it willy-nilly. It doesn't invest in nuclear arms. It doesn't invest in tobacco. And it's got its own ethics council that decides what they shouldn't invest in. Now, there's been a lot of noise around Israel and what's happening on the Gaza Strip and the West Bank lately, and people arguing that the oil fund should not invest in Israeli companies that are in any way involved in that campaign. It emerged that the oil fund had in fact invested in a company, for instance, that is very closely involved in maintaining fighter jets, Israeli fighter jets that are being used in Gaza. Now, the oil fund has pulled out of quite a few Israeli companies now. Last week, though, it also pulled out of Caterpillar. That's the US huge American manufacturer of bulldozers and other digging machines. They are being used, bulldozers from Caterpillars are being used on the West Bank to flatten Palestinian homes, and it's also used in Gaza. So this was seen as unethical by the fund, and they pulled out. Now, that prompted a huge reaction in America. Senator Lindsey Graham was one of the critics who was most vocal and said this was a disgrace. So Norway shouldn't use the fund as a political tool. like this. And it prompted the Norwegian Prime Minister to send Graham a text trying to explain that the oil fund is indeed apolitical and it's just guided by ethics.
It's a difficult thing, though, that it cannot be apolitical, can it?
No, it's a tricky one. This, I mean, ethics, you could argue, must be political, but it is supposed to be based on human rights and rules and regulations laid down by the UN. But of course, it will always be seen as political by someone. It is a problem for the fund itself, of course, because if it is seen as being too political, its independence will be challenged, perhaps by some, making it less solid in a way. So it is striving all the time to try to say that we are basically guided by ethics and that it's not political. It's not steered by the government in charge in Norway at any point. It's an independent committee that is just following guidelines.
Let's move on to something closer to home, and that's public transport and Oslo. And many people in the United Kingdom, at least, will be aware of the wrong leaves on the line, throwing a spanner in the works for any kind of public transport in bad weather. Oslo has a particularly summery problem.
Yeah, it's been an interesting, to put it that way, summer in terms of public transport in Norway. You've got one of the busiest ring roads, the innermost ring road in Oslo, has been closed, and it will remain closed for quite some time because of construction work in the city centre on a new government headquarters. We've also had refurbishment of the busiest metro station in the city centre, so loads of metro trains have been cancelled or shut down basically most of the summer. But now the trams have all been taken out of action because of the wrong kind of sand. Now, you might wonder why they need sand, but they use it to brake, basically. So they've got little sand containers in front of every wheel, and they drop sand in front of the wheel to create friction between the wheels and the track. And this is very helpful in very wet conditions, but also in icy conditions. So in winter, it's absolutely crucial. Now, someone, we don't know whom, have put the wrong kind of sand in those containers. There's basically two cores, and it's been clogging up the pipes that release the sand, and all the trams have been taken out of action. And we just heard yesterday that they will be actually out of action for another week. Which doesn't really help the overall situation in Oslo right now.
No, and everyone's coming back into work. And you haven't had... it's been quite a busy summer for commuting and for problems with transport, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Oslo is a relatively small cities. You can walk most places, but a lot of commuters do use public transport. It is very popular. A lot of people do cycle as well. So we've seen far more cyclists this summer because of the problems on the transport system. So with the closing of the metro station in Majorstua, which is one of the main hubs, has been very detrimental, which basically blocks a lot of the transport from the suburbs, where a lot of commuters do come in from. So it's been luckily happening over the summer holidays. So a lot of people have not been absolutely dependent on it. But now that people are back in work, it is showing its real potential for chaos.
Lars, thank you so much indeed for joining us. That was Lars Bevanger, our Monocle Oslo correspondent. Vinny, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, there's a really good story in the Guardian today about some disquiet in Normandy over the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, this was sort of heralded earlier this summer as this really great thing. President Macron came for a state visit. He announced this. It has been not just years, but decades in the making. The UK requested it come over in 1952 for Queen Elizabeth II's coronation.
Apparently it took longer than Brexit to negotiate it.
Yeah, it's taken a couple of years and it's been ebbing and flowing. But the man who seemingly managed to sort of sort it all out is George Osborne, the former Chancellor here. And he's now a sort of high-powered official at the British Museum, and he helped smooth the negotiations. But it seems like the actual people who work to conserve the Bayeux Tapestry aren't happy about its big cross-channel move. And what they're actually going to do is, because the building that it's in was built in the early 1980s, it's no longer fit for purpose. They're going to have to remove it from the building for this sort of construction work to be done. But the plan is now to take it onto a special Eurostar train, to move it to London and then to sort of bring it to the British Museum. But many of the curators are saying they were aghast when they heard the announcement because they think it's in too fragile a condition to do it. But what's interesting in the article is there appears to be a little bit of a little sleight of hand here, because it turns out that actually France hasn't been storing it correctly. For much of the last sort of 45 years, it's been hung vertically on a rail, which has done considerably more damage. It should have been flat this entire time. And so perhaps there's a little bit of guilt here that they haven't been looking after it.
Oh, this is such an interesting story. For those of us who don't know what the Bayeux Tapestry is, it's a 68-metre-long cartoon. It depicts the invasion of the Norman invasion of England in 1066. And it was stitched and pulled together as an emblem of Norman brilliance. The interesting thing is, actually, if you want to see it today, you can. It's the last day that the Bayeux Tapestry Museum is open. So if you're in Normandy and you're listening, you have a few hours to get yourself together before it goes away, because the museum is closing for 2 years for refurbishment. So many people are seeing this as that moment when you get Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, and it all becomes this wonderfully brilliant political moment. And this is the strange thing about it, isn't it? That the petitions that are emerging in France are not just about the condition. They're about this sort of sacrificing of French identity and French pride, etc., etc. It's all gone absolutely out of control.
Yeah, I mean, the top of the Guardian article is titled La Tapisserie, c'est moi. You know, the tapestry, it's me, it's France. But there are many people in the UK who think that actually the tapestry should have never left the UK and that it should be returned to the UK. I mean, I can't tell you how important 1066 is in the British mind. Every student in year 7, going into our version of secondary school this week, they will start their first history class in 1066, because that is where the history of modern Britain begins. Almost 1,000-year line of throughs from, Duke of Normandy coming through to, the king here today. And there are people that say, it was actually woven, they think, by British seamstresses to tell the story of this battle, and that eventually, it went back to Normandy, but that perhaps when Normandy, the link was severed, it should have come back here to the UK. But I mean, there is huge excitement for this coming to the UK. It's going to be sort of a blockbuster that the British Museum hasn't really had since the Terracotta Warriors, which was, sort of 15 years ago now. But yeah, whether or not they can override the curators' objections to this and this feeling that it shouldn't be coming, when actually there's quite a strong claim that it shouldn't be kept in Britain.
Indeed.
Actually, Vinny, do you know the shortest British history lesson that there is, that there are 3 dates that every British child should know, or English child should know? 1066, 1666, 1966. 1066, the Norman invasion. 1666, the Great Fire of London. 1966, when England won the World Cup.
So the interesting thing about this is that they haven't really talked about how people have treated the Bayeux Tapestry over the years. It's a very old piece of material. What very few people know about, but it's adequately catalogued everywhere, is that the Nazis moved it several times. And they moved it. They probably didn't look after it in the way that it will be looked after when it is transported. Yes. But it was, I'm just reading now, it was placed in an underground shelter. It was then moved to the Louvre. It was moved and moved and moved and moved. And the Nazis were absolutely obsessed with it because it was a sort of a story of conquest. And no one has really said, what have people been doing with this tapestry until post-war? Because obviously post-war everybody decided that it needed to be looked after immaculately. But the fact is that it has been shunted from pillar to post on, I think, on goodness knows what kinds of transport since 1066. So why are people getting into such a tizzy about it?
It was found up sort of wrapped up in itself in the cathedral basement in Bayeux, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's not really been looked after until now. So I'm wondering whether actually with enough care and attention it might be all right. What are your thoughts, Stephen?
Well, one hopes it is. I mean, it is, in all seriousness, it is a very valuable historic document, as you say, a cartoon, but nevertheless very valuable. And I'm very interested to hear what Vinny was saying about it being wrongly staged, because I saw it a few years ago. We were in Normandy and we went to see it, and you go around this sort of U-shaped corridor and looking at it, and it is very interesting to see it. But I didn't realise that there was this problem about the way it had been hung. So when it comes to London, is the British Museum going to have it flat?
It will be flat, and it will forever. And when the new museum opens, it will be flat. There is an admission there, tacitly, I suppose, that they've been displaying it the wrong way for 40 years.
But it's very interesting how will you then look at it? Because having seen it hanging, you'll have to be raised up and
you'll
looking
be on raised platforms looking down at it.
I think that I can't remember when I saw it whether it was hung up or not, but I remember sort of looking, and it was on a slant and an angle. I mean, the thing that I not worry about, but I think that one of the biggest challenges faced is that the Bayeux Tapestry is seen by 250,000 people each year in Bayeux, which is a lot of people, but it's not as many as people are going to go to the British Museum. And when it's something on this scale, how does a museum display something which people will be desperate to see, but it's not a big thing that you stand back and look at in scale? You look at it in detail. You want to stop and you want to go. You want to dive deep.
I mean, they haven't released the tickets yet or really information about it, but I think it's going to be the sort of hot ticket. But I think it's going to be tightly controlled numbers of groups going in. But I think we'll see extended opening hours on the museum to sort of facilitate people going in. They already do sort of museum lates at the British Museum. I think it's going to be, something that's open from about 6 a.m. and closes at 11 p.m. every day. It's here, and it's going to be taking in groups.
It's funny, you've seen, I think there was an exhibition I went to in the Netherlands a few years ago, which was so oversubscribed, they ended up doing 24 hours opening, which was quite something. Who can imagine going to see the Bayeux Tapestry after a night out in Soho? Just going to go off and look at the most beautiful pieces of history ever made. Any other stories that you've spotted, Stephen?
There is, of course, something which Vinny mentioned earlier, the more seriously, perhaps, not that I'm saying the Bayeux Tapestry is not serious, but the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in China, in Tianjin, and it's a routine meeting in one sense from this organisation which was set up just over about a dozen years ago by China and Russia and 4 states from Central Asia, and has 10 members and other associate members. But it's particularly interesting because what we're going to see this week are Putin, Xi and Modi from India, all the 3 of them together, which I think is the first time that the 3 of them will have been all side by side. You've got, of course, Putin very grateful to China because China tacitly is giving more support than they would admit to the war in Ukraine. He's also very grateful to Modi because Modi has been buying lots of Russian oil, even though he's now been slapped with 50% sanctions by the Americans for doing so. So the politics around this one will be very interesting to follow in the coming days.
It will. And the idea, I think they all saw each other last year, actually, in Kazan in Russia. But this idea, I'm just looking at a picture now from last year when you have Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin and Narendra Modi. And Xi Jinping being Vladimir Putin, you sort of know where they stand. But Modi finds himself absolutely in a corner.
Yeah, and this is the first time Modi's been to China in, I think, 7 years, and they had problems with Indian and Chinese forces coming into conflict, I think, in the Himalayan border in recent times as well, so they've had to move past that. I mean, it is interesting for Modi because India has sort of come under huge criticism from the West for continuing to buy oil and continuing to buy weapons from Russia. Now, there are many alternatives that it could buy weapons from other than Russia. The oil dependency is something that, is very tricky because the price point is such that the scale that they need that it is hard for them to potentially find the alternatives that they can. So the tricky part of all this for them is that they're trying to do sort of deals with the West. Their population, due to quirks of history, are incredibly Western-facing. Many of the young people want to come to universities in the United States, in Canada, in the UK, English being such a dominant language there as well. But this sort of playing this careful line that he's got to tread now with turning up and being there. He's not going to stay, I think, for the big parade, which is interesting, the military parade that's taking place for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. You've got Kim Jong-un from North Korea rocking up at that, and they're going to be displaying the latest weapons. So he's not sticking around for that sort of pomp and pageantry, but it will be interesting to see how he plays this and what the reaction is from Donald Trump.
It's an interesting article that's in the New York Times this weekend, which sets the scene for this meeting both in China but also this parade that you talk about there, Vinny. And it says that, and this is something for you, Stephen, that it said in speeches, Xi Jinping has sought to recast World War II as a struggle in which China and the Soviet Union were the decisive theatres of battle. And it says that Mr. Putin has echoed this. It's trying to shift claims of victory away from the West and towards China and Russia, not least because tens of millions of people in those countries died.
I think that we're slightly paying for our own pride in the West, in so much as the Russian effort, I wouldn't so much say the Chinese effort, but certainly the Russian effort was huge, or the Soviet effort in World War II, an estimated 27 million people lost. And often I think the Americans tend to flag wave and paint it as it was their victory. This, of course, is a result of the Cold War, when it was not done to give the Soviet Union much praise. And unfortunately, we talked earlier about history lessons for the students at school. And I think that this is one where there needs to be a real revision. People need to be taught, the Second World War was a major part of all our histories. And the Soviet Union needs to be given its credit, but at the same time, there's little facts that are completely ignored, like the fact that the Battle of Moscow, when Moscow came close to being taken by the Germans, there were more American tanks that took part in the defence of Moscow than there were Russian, Soviet-made tanks. So Russia always plays down the Arctic convoys, which brought huge amounts of aid and weaponry to the Soviet Union, and without which the Soviet Union almost certainly would have fallen. So, unfortunately, the Second World War has become, if you go back right to the beginning of the programme, politicised because of the conflicts between East and West, both in the Cold War and now. And I think that there are historians who've made attempts to make a much more balanced view of it, but I'm still not sure it reaches the classrooms in, for example, Britain or America.
Let's move on to a story that I think, Vinny, you wanted to talk about, which is we're still talking about battle. We've become quite conflict heavy this morning, from Bayer to battles on the opera stage. The White House is this amazing reconfiguration of the identity of America continues.
Yeah, the Department of Defense, Donald Trump wants to rebrand it as the Department of War, which, saying something is Orwellian is an overused term, but this is literally 1984, converting it to sort of Department of War, isn't it? This is a move that he wants, and it's sort of how he's trying to, this was last used, this term, in 1947, so it was previously called the Department of War, but the sort of need to change and alter and put himself into everything, the Kennedy Center, trying to completely restructure that in terms of culture, reaching into the Department of Defense, trying to sort of restructure and rebrand that. It's all sort of marketing. This is Donald Trump's home territory. It's just fascinating that, getting obsessed with this kind of small little thing and then sort of, branding anyone that sort of disagrees with it as not being a patriot.
I think it was the Minister of Peace in 1984. I think that, if I remember rightly. But it plays into the same narrative, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, it's I first read 1984 in 1974, I think, when, of course, it was still seen as a prediction. Although, of course, the only reason that Orwell chose 1984 was because he wrote it in 1948 and switched the last two numbers around. But I do find it terrifying. I've read the book a few times and seen the film and seen the stage version, which is deeply depressing. But it is even more depressing now when you see what is happening. And the idea that the world could be split into three major powers and two of them are always allies or against the other one, and then the next day suddenly the other two are allies and the other one's the enemy. It really does seem to be playing out. And I mean, Donald Trump plays right into this idea. The phrase, I think, which is particularly relevant for Trump and for Putin is that 1984 was supposed to be a warning, not a handbook.
And indeed, the interesting thing, though, is it plays into the wider question of how a country brands itself internally to its citizens. And this is something that Putin has done for a very, very long time. He's a master of it by saying we need to invade other people. Well, to cut a long story short, we need to invade other people in order to protect our own identity.
Protect our own identity, our own people, ignoring the fact that Russian-speaking, as much of eastern Ukraine, the people there have first language has been Russian before Ukrainian, but because they're Russian-speaking does not make them Russian. I mean, otherwise that means that Britain could take over the whole of America or Australia. It's such an absurd idea, and yet, because of the way he censors the population, a lot of people do believe him. And talking, if I can just quickly add, because it's coming up to the 1st of September, tomorrow censorship of the Russian population is going to be even greater.
Tell us about this. This is the idea of the way that we communicate nowadays, which is via phones, are going to be absolutely tightened. Absolutely
tightened. The screws have been tightening down for some time. And so instead of WhatsApp, they now, if you buy a phone in Russia, you will have Max put on it, which is a Russian version of WhatsApp, a messaging service. But of course, it's one that the government can monitor. It's not encrypted. It's not kept secret. If you want to download any other apps, you can't go to the Apple Store. You have to go to Roo Store. These are all going to be in force from tomorrow. If you lend your phone to someone or your SIM card who's not an immediate member of your family, you run the risk of prosecution and indeed possibly facing a jail sentence. You might sort of give your phone to your friend saying, "Oh, look, Dad, copy my number and ring me back." That will be an offence as of tomorrow in Russia.
And the enforcement of these, it sounds like a very, very prohibitive and blanket ban on the freedom of communication. But how, in fact, this is going to be enforced is going to require tremendous effort.
That is one of the big questions. But it comes down almost. Let's go back to 1984 and see that Winston Smith was able to carry out his nefarious activities, as seemed nefarious by the rulers, for some time before they did crack down on him. And I think that's the worry in Russia, that people will drop their guard if they think that they're fine still, if they're able to use WhatsApp, use a VPN, because having a VPN will not be illegal for now. Everyone expects it will be soon. But if you look for what they term extremist information on a VPN, you have broken the law. And these things will be tracked. I mean, the Russians have put huge efforts into digital information in all sorts, both negative and positive. And the negative is winning now. And so they will be thinking of ways in which they can track people. And anyone who puts out something on this new thing, Max, this messaging service, which is seen as, for example, critical of the war, will risk at least a fine and possibly a prison sentence.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it, that the cracking down of the use of the wrong kind of communication tool is very obvious and open in Russia. But it just goes back to what you were saying earlier on, that everybody's got something Chinese on their phones everywhere else.
Yeah,
actually there's a willful sacrifice, a willful handing over of your own privacy just simply by popping onto TikTok.
Yeah, there is, and there have been warnings from Western intelligence services about this, about what joining TikTok does, about the information TikTok can gather from your phone or on other stuff. I think they maybe need to get a little bit stronger on those warnings and do a bit more explaining about them. But just on this Russian app, I mean, that basically is the kind of state control of interpersonal relationships, even, that has never really been seen before. If you have to use this messaging app, all of your personal information, everyone you talk to, the state has a complete log of essentially your entire life.
It's no different to the Stasi listening to your neighbours, is it?
No, it's not. It's just a modern version of it. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, gentlemen. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, Stephen Dalziel and Vincent McAviney, joining me in this studio. Lars Bevanger, our Oslo correspondent, and celebrating his mother's 80th birthday in Lisbon, Tyler Brûlé, our editorial director. Thanks to our producer, Desiree Bandley, Mariella Bevan, and our studio engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Emma Nelson. Monocle on Sunday is back next week. But until then, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.